Okay, now am I off of mute? Yeah, okay, good. All right, well, thank you, Marianne and Sarah. It is my great pleasure to introduce my friends, Kimberly and Barb. I hope you all had a chance to read their bios in the messenger or, in our announcement information, because I'm not going to read that whole information that was posted. But I will introduce Kimberly Barrett and then Barb. Dr. Kimberly Barrett is Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and Associate Dean for the faculty at Lawrence. But I met Kimberly when she first came to Lawrence, since I'm a very active alumna there. And now I have the distinct pleasure of working with her on the Belonging Committee for Imagine Fox Cities. And I will admit, one of the reasons I agreed to serve on that committee was to be able to work directly with Dr. Barrett twice a month. So it's been a wonderful experience for me. It was that committee that created the discussion guides that we've been using for our belonging conversation. So you'll hear more about that in a little bit. Dr. Barrett, I can't stress enough the doctor, following the discussion we had earlier, holds graduate degrees in psychology and higher education. So we'll hear from her in a very quick minute here. And then Barb LaMue is currently president and CEO of the New North. For those of you who may not be familiar, the New North is an 18-county regional economic development agency that's focused on, to me, a few keywords: regional. So we look at Northeast Wisconsin as a region with economic power. And then it also relies heavily on collaboration. So we look to collaboration between the different entities in our part of the state. The focus is on strategies for business and talent development. And so I've met Barb when she first took her position. Actually, I think, Barb, it goes back to before you first took your position. But at that time, we were working on efforts that support our entrepreneurial community in the New North. And I'm still involved with that work. But more recently, we're working together on a new committee that's focused on diversity and inclusion in the area. And I'm sure Barb will talk about that. In fact, that's, I think, all Barb will talk about. So Barb has quite a few years of experience in economic development, and she's a certified economic developer as well as economic development finance professional. So obviously this really is Barb's expertise in economic development. So with that, I will turn this over to Kimberly. So I think the way we're going to do this is Kimberly will cover her information and then we'll switch to Barb. So if you have questions that come up, jot them down and we'll field questions after Barb speaks. Right? Okay, take it away, Kimberly.
Thank you, Irene, for that very kind introduction. And I'm glad you didn't go through all the written information that was in the promotional material. So thank you for that as well. And good afternoon. And I would really like to begin by thanking you for the invitation to talk to you about a topic that many people consider to be our nation's original sin, and that is racism. I'd also like to share my extreme gratitude for your willingness to be on this Zoom call today, to discuss ways that you can become co-conspirators in deconstructing race and interrupting systems that support white supremacy. And when I say white supremacy, I'm not talking about the hate that's spewed by groups like the Klan. I'm really talking about the hierarchy of human value based on skin color that really served as the foundation of all of our systems in the US, legal, economic, and cultural, and really impact our lives, whether you're a person of color or not, every day. And although we've begun to really chip away at our racist foundations, we have a long way to go to replace them with something that is truly anti-racist. And, we can see from the protests this summer the police-involved shootings and murder that still exist, that really sparked a global uprising for racial justice, that we still have a long way to go. And so what I'll do is begin with just some definitions to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of just the key terms that we're talking about. And then we'll get into some recommendations about how you can be anti-racist. And really, when I talk about being an anti-racist, it really is a daily practice. There are opportunities each day that we have to make a difference and to interrupt systems of racism in our country, in our lives, and even in the world. So first, let's start off by talking about what is race. You've often heard race referred to as a social construct. So what does that mean? That really means that it was a concept created to support a certain cultural and economic reality. And I want to just be very clear here that if you're talking about race from a biological perspective, there's only one species of human beings alive on the earth today, that's Homo sapiens, and all of us share 99.9% of the same genetic, makeup. And so, in fact, there is no, from a biological standpoint, thing called race. It is a social and cultural construct. Now, that's not to say that there's not a lot of variation and diversity within these groups we call races. But when you talk about, racial differences, they really are only skin deep. They are not a way to determine what somebody's abilities are. Because we're all one species, we all have the same range of intellectual, physical, and moral reasoning abilities. So how did we come to develop what I call this myth of race? How did we all come to take for granted that we have different races in the world? And this, don't get me wrong, when I say myth of race, it's a myth with very real consequences, even deadly consequences, as I mentioned earlier. Well, our current way of thinking about race came into being around the 17th century, when our ancestors from around the world came together for the first time in one region, the Americas, to live together. At the same time, we had two very different conflicting movements afoot. As you know, one was the transatlantic slave trade, which exchanged people from the continent of Africa for goods. And the other was a philosophy of freedom in the form of democratic self-governance, in which every man, and at that time they didn't mean man, and usually they meant men who owned land, could determine their own fate within some form of elected representative government. As you know, the transatlantic slave trade was a form of human trafficking that would become the bedrock of the economy of our newly formed nation. So how do you reconcile these two different movements that were going on, economic and philosophical? Some of our country's founders brought these two very discordant ideas together by questioning whether these people who look a little different from them and have different customs might actually be less human than those of European descent. They literally questioned the humanity of folks in ways that had not happened in the world before. One example is a quote from Thomas Jefferson in his notes from the state of Virginia. "I advance, therefore, a suspicion only that blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to whites in the endowments of both body and mind, thus planting in the imagination of a country the inferiority of one race to the other that extended not only to enslaved Africans, but any who could not claim to be white who came after them." And, Jefferson might have been a conflicted racist, but he obviously was not stupid. He also foresaw the vicious cycle of racial injustice and mutual hostility that slavery would spawn. He wrote, "There must be doubtless and unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one hand, and degrading submission on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal, and no doubt we did imitate it, and people are still imitating those relationships that began with that questioning of the humanity of Black folks back when it was used as a justification for slavery. However, and when I talk about anti-racism, I have in mind particularly African Americans and indigenous populations. And when you look at the way that Jefferson, although he was not in the majority, thought about Native Americans, it was a little different. Although he and others at the time spoke of Native Americans as noble savages, he wrote the following in his notes on the state of Virginia. I believe that the Indian then to be in body and mind equal to the white, and only their environment, culture, and way of life needed to be changed to make them fully American in Jefferson's mind. And this, of course, ensconced another stereotype about the inferiority of cultures that were not European, sort of that colonization mindset. So anti-Blackness was the root of racism that expanded to other groups who could not claim to be white in America. And through example, the legacy of slavery and racism, albeit in different forms, has been exported around the world. So today we see many negative consequences of this racism that began to justify slavery. We see invisible change around the aspirations and opportunities of the descendants of slaves in this country, as well as those who are not considered white or who are considered in some way foreign. And we know some of the racial stereotypes that are out there about Asians, for example, and other groups really sort of mark them as forever sort of foreign. Consider, for example, the gap in household wealth that exists between African Americans and whites. What do you think that gap is? I can't see everybody, but let's just, for the people I can see, maybe I could see you. What do you think it is? Do you think it's like the gap, the gender gap, which is 80 something cents to the, or 80 something dollars to the $100? Do you think it's like that? Do you think it's a little worse, maybe 60 to 100? What do you think? How about more or less? Do you think it's greater or worse than the worst? Okay, you're right, but you probably would not have guessed that it's $5 to the $100 in terms of household wealth, the difference there. And although there were some gains in 2019, as income inequality increases, so does that household wealth gap between African Americans and whites. You've all heard about the other consequences of racism. For anybody who doesn't think that structural racism still exists, one of the ways that it's been brought into stark relief with the pandemic are the health-related inequities. And, we've heard about the difference in cancer treatment outcomes, the prevalence of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But because we're women, I thought it would be interesting to bring up this gap that, women, Black women, African-American women are 5 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women. And these differences exist despite socioeconomic status or access to insurance. So it's not just an issue of class. It really does have to do with health disparities around race. And we all know about the injustices that still exist in our criminal justice system, particularly when you look at the tragic rate of incarceration in general of US citizens in the US compared to other comparable nations, but it particularly hits our African Americans hard. When we look at incarceration rates, they are also 5 times that of whites. But it's even worse in Wisconsin. Does anybody know the disparity in incarceration rates for African Americans in Wisconsin versus whites? Nationally, it's about 5 times. In Wisconsin, it is 10 times the rate of whites. So, very, very stark disparities, considering that, in terms of our humanity, we all share the same abilities, the same, moral capacities, the same intellect as groups. And so why is that? Why do we see these differences? And the only explanation is systemic racism. Unfortunately, racism is self-perpetuating because you start these stories, these socially constructed ideas around race, and then you create practices and policies based on that. And then what happens? You have inequities, right? Like the inequities I just talked about. And then those inequities feed into the stereotypes and support those myths around racial differences. And so it's a self-perpetuating cycle that really needs to be called out and intentionally ended before we can change things. That cycle just feeds into stereotypes. And so then it guides our future behavior, which then further makes more inequities. So that's the social construction of race, my mini lecture on that. So when you talk about racism, that's just a belief in this hierarchy of human value based on skin color. With whites or those with lighter skin, there's something called colorism that's within groups that really speaks to this, how this issue of white supremacy affects within groups who might be minorities. But on the other hand, we have this idea of anti-racism. And the thing about anti-racism that is so important and so different is that it moves us from the defensiveness of saying, I'm not racist, and then letting it go at that and leaving these systems in place, to being actively engaged in interrupting these systems. And so that is the power in this concept. And so the way I would define anti-racism is a practice, and again, I would say a daily practice of identifying, challenging, and changing the beliefs and practices that perpetuate structural racism in order to redistribute power in more equitable ways, both in terms of economic and social capital. And so whenever you're talking about discrimination, oppression, whether you're talking about sexism, racism, heterosexism, it's all about power. And so how do we interrupt systems of racism in this case so that power is more equitably distributed? And I want to share with you a quote from Ibram X. Kendi. And if you haven't read his book on how to be an anti-racist, I would certainly recommend that. It's a very accessible, personal explanation of anti-racism. But let me read this to you. And I think it brings home this whole idea around anti-racism. To be anti-racist is to think nothing is behaviorally wrong or right, inferior or superior with any racial groups. Whenever the anti-racist sees individuals behaving positively or negatively, the anti-racist sees exactly that. Individuals behaving positively or negatively, not representative of whole races. To be anti-racist is to deracialize behavior, to remove the tattooed stereotype from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races do. So that to me really sums up the goal that we're looking to get to. And the reason why being colorblind doesn't help us get here is because we have so many entrenched systems of racism that we really have to open our eyes, not be blind to anything, and recognize the impact that racism has on the work that we do, the lives that we lead, and the individuals that we interact with. So how can we how can we as individuals within our workplace, as parents, as elders in the community who have influence, how can we make a difference? And, I would say, and I'm going to talk about some specific examples, but quickly, I would say three things. One, we have to continue learning every day to understand that this is a moving target. It changes, and we have to continue to learn, whether it's reading books, whether it's talking to folks, watching television programs. I shared a list of resources to get you started or to help you continue. I'm sure that many of you have already started this work, but it's an ongoing process. It is a marathon, not a sprint. So there's no magic wand answer I'm going to give you today. We all have to put in the work. So number one, keep learning, and not only learning about other people, but learning about yourselves, understanding your own biases and blind spots and ways that you may sort of self-correct. Second, you have to share that learning with others. And that can be through formal presentations. It can be through casual conversations. It can be through changes in your behavior that are examples. But you have to share what you learn. Just keeping it to yourself isn't enough. And lastly, in terms of what you can do as an individual, generally speaking, is to develop a mindfulness practice. Because since this is a marathon and not a sprint, you got to be in it for the long term. It takes patience, it takes intention, and it also takes compassion. And sometimes having compassion for folks who you would think, don't deserve it. But compassion is for both you and the other people involved, so you can stay on this path and so that we can make it a better place for all of us. So I'd say first, continuous learning, including identifying your own biases, starting with yourself, like all change. So continuous learning. Second, share that learning with others. And third, commit to a mindfulness practice so you can continue to be intentional. You can slow down, because even if you say you're not a racist and you try not to be a racist, we all grew up in a culture where white supremacy was part of the expectation, the unwritten rules in our society. And so even without thinking, sometimes we can act in racist ways. Doesn't mean you're racist, but one day you can act in anti-racist ways, and another day you can act in ways that support the systems that are there. So just becoming aware of your own blind spots. In parts of organizations, what we can do is make sure that we apply an equity mindset to the work that we do in that organization, and really look at policies and practices in terms of 6 questions. And this is from an article on allyship. It's called "In the Paradoxes of Allyship." And some questions you should ask when you're looking at your organization and your practices: who do they benefit? Who do they exclude? What systems do they maintain? From what cultural lens are they understood? Are they relevant today or holdovers to an earlier time? Now, some traditional things are great and effective and are universally effective, but many are not. So are they relevant for today, or just you're doing it because that's the way it's done? And then if they're problematic, what will it take to change it? How can you start being a catalyst for that change? So really taking an equity mindset and just seeing who's benefiting from this and who is not, who's at the table and who is not. How can we invite them in? And not just waiting to invite them in when you need them for a discussion like this, but looking to invite them in everyday activities, asking people out to coffee, asking them to go to your place of worship if you have a place of worship, just really starting to expand the people who are in your social and professional inner circles, so that they are more diverse, so that they include African Americans, so that they include Indigenous folks, so that they include other people of color. And don't just do it, when you need something from them. Do it in a way that is mutually beneficial. Let's see some other examples, and I know that I'm running out of time here. if you're a parent, talk to your children about racism and human equality very directly, of course, in age-appropriate ways. Lots of books out there. Southern Poverty Law Center has Teaching Tolerance, which is the materials are directed towards teachers, but they're good for parents too. There are lots of books out there, dolls. Make sure that you create an environment where they grow up knowing people who look different than they do, knowing people who of different races and cultures and backgrounds. No better way to be anti-racist is to stop people from learning these racist lessons to begin with. Wouldn't it be great if we weren't all sitting here trying to unlearn racism? So with our children, we have the chance to do that. I think that also you need to look at budgets. How are you spending your money? Are you spending it in trainings and with providers, with people who are women or minority-owned businesses? What's your spend? How are you spending your time? And if you are the leader of an organization, do you have these anti-racist goals baked in to your job descriptions, your skills that you're looking for in folks, into your performance evaluations and into your reward systems? So really, are you thinking strategically about ways to promote racial justice throughout your organization, whether it's a work organization, volunteer organization, and not just doing it, Black History Month or when there's a uprising, and protest, but really having it become part of the way things are done. And the way that starts is being able to talk about it. People are very uncomfortable talking about race because we know that there's a problem with race in our country. And so it's like walking on eggshells, but we won't be able to deal with the problem until we face it and are able to talk about it and are able to have sometimes difficult discussions. And, that's why these discussion guides are so important. I know you're going through a second round of them. I would encourage everyone to participate, because what you're really doing is skill building for yourself and for our community to be able to tackle these difficult topics in productive ways, and not going into the conversation thinking that you're going to change people's mind, but going in with an open heart and mind yourself, thinking that you're just putting a different way of seeing the world out there. And even if people don't respond the way you would like at first, who knows when what you have said will come up and they'll be able to use it either to change themselves or to help, change another situation. And so I think, coming in to these discussions, not with the objective to change people's minds, but with the objective to just enter into a different kind of conversation, put a different way of thinking out there, and being able to listen and understand where they're coming from as well. So it's really about listening and learning and understanding from each other, but we have to make sure that we have spaces where we're all at the table. With that said, right now we don't have those spaces. We're more segregated than we were probably in the 70s. In the 80s, we made a little bit of progress in the 60s and 70s with desegregation, but now our schools, our neighborhoods, places we worship are more segregated than ever. And so even if you are in a space that is now, for example, all white, it's still important to have these conversations. So I'd say a good place to start is with the resource list that I shared with you, and with the discussions that you all will be holding later. Your organization will be holding. So I urge you to participate in those. Keep learning, keep growing. I'm sure I've gone over my time a bit, but thank you all for your attention. And I do urge you to look at the resources that I shared. And there's a couple of good ones. I think all of them are foundational to understanding how to be an anti-racist. So thank you.
So shall we just move on to Barb and the New North?
Great. Thank you so much, Irene. And thank you, Dr. Barrett, for that very insightful presentation. And I think these are things that we need to be incredibly mindful of every day. So that really does dovetail very nicely into what we've been working on at the New North. And I have a presentation that I will bring up. Can you all see that?
Yep, it's good.
Okay, great. So I want to just preface this by saying I've been with New North about 1.5 years, and prior to that, I was one of the vice presidents at WEDC in business and community development. And part of that is we supported our diverse businesses, the minority chambers of commerce across the state. Now, these are statewide organizations. So I served on their boards of directors and connected them. We did provide dollars that they could actually bring staff on to their organizations. And those were the Hispanic Chamber, the Native American, the African American, the Hispanic, the LGBTQ Chamber, and the Wisconsin Veterans Chamber. We then formed the Ethnically Diverse Business Coalition with those leaders. And I knew that resource, while they're statewide organizations, they're primarily based in Milwaukee. So we are in conversations with them about how we can make those resources much more accessible to our communities here in Northeast Wisconsin. So as far as, let me go a page down. What we did at the New North, oh, it's not letting me advance my slides. There we go. So we actually, at New North, we realized that we need to become a much more welcoming community. Henry Sanders, who some of you may know Henry, he was part of the Obama administration and had started some chambers in the greater Madison area. He and I had a meeting, and he shared with me that his wife is originally from Pickett outside of Oshkosh, so they have ties to the region. And he said, Barb, your region does not do a good job at retaining talent of color. In fact, in his research, 90% of people that are recruited here for employment purposes, if they're a person of color, do not stay. And that was incredibly disturbing to me. And it's like, why is that happening? And more importantly, how do we change that? So we were able to convene a group of leaders. And, thank you to Dr. Barrett being part of those, and Irene and Darcy Pearson. Darcy's with Oshkosh Corporation. Many of you know her. We decided that we wanted to pull together leaders and find out currently what's being done. Now, this work does not negate the fact that we know our chambers, the Fox Cities chambers was referenced before, the Greater Green Bay Chamber, local communities are really trying to tackle this problem, but it's a huge issue and it needs to be also handled on a region-wide basis. So as a part of this group, we convened facilitated roundtables led by Darcy and Irene. Our first session was just to get an environmental scan of what is going on in the region. Are there some best practices that we can advance? We then did some whiteboarding to come up with some potential regional strategies. And then we broke it down into youth, K-12, young professionals, entrepreneurs and small business, corporations, and then the general population and community. And I believe you have all access to these slides. So I'm only going to focus on a few of the tiles in each of the categories, but please know this is not the be all end all. This is just another point of discussion as we develop an implementation plan. We look at things that we can change most immediately in our communities to be a much more welcoming and understanding community. And then those that are going to take additional resources that might be a little bit more long-term. And then obviously making sure that we can measure the success. What are the metrics that's going to be able to determine, are we making a difference in this particular area? So the first category as it relates to youth and K-12, Going back to that list of people, we wanted to make sure that our school districts were at the table. So we did have the Appleton Area School District and the Greater Green Bay School District that did talk about some things that they feel are needed to be able to assist our youth, and racism starts at birth. So how do we stem that tide? So there are things like improving the demographics of school employees, of school leaders, so that if you are an Indigenous person and you're being taught by white folks the whole time, you don't have quite that sense of aspiration that you want to be an educator. So we know we're not going to change that overnight, but understanding kind of hiring practices that go on with our school districts and what can we do to change that. We also know that it's important for businesses to get involved, and can they kind of adopt and mentor a person of color? We know the STARS program through the Boys and Girls Club is successful. How do we scale that across our whole region? The very last tile was just even things like changing the terminology. We reference student at risk. They get put into a class, and that's perhaps not, they're only at risk because people are not addressing their needs. So how do we make sure that we're not putting labels on people at a very early age or ever that leads to systemic racism down the road? As it relates to young professionals, we've been working a lot with Sabrina Robbins with the African Heritage and the work that they are doing, looking at how we can continue to support that. We have worked with Milwaukee in the past in our Connect and Main Street communities across our region, and they have a fairly robust diversity program that they offer to local chambers. We want to make sure that that is accessible here in Northeast Wisconsin. We also want to make sure that we're providing the social life that young talent is interested in. My daughter lives in Milwaukee, and she said she loves Milwaukee. And she said, Mom, Green Bay, Appleton, nice communities, but I don't want to move into a community any longer that everybody looks like me. I love that diversity. I embrace that diversity, and it's making me a better person. And we know as we work to attract talent, that is a sentiment of the majority of the individuals that we would love for them to have them call New North home. We then took a look at entrepreneurship, small business, and corporations, and what we can do to assist in that category. You might have all seen the news yesterday, the press release about the equity fund that the Green Bay Packers, Microsoft, the Milwaukee Bucks, and the Milwaukee Brewers launched. And this is a fund that is going to help support entrepreneurs of color and Latinx founders, so that these business ideas can get launched much more quickly. Dr. Barrett had talked about income inequality. So how do we change that? And providing tools and education and resources at a much earlier time in a person's journey may be a way that can be done. We also are looking at board development as nonprofits and for-profit companies, making sure that they are better reflecting the community. New eyes see new things, and how you make sure that you have diversity. You just don't speak it, but you have them on your board. You put them in leadership positions across your corporations. The last slide really focuses on general population in the community, and this is where we feel we have the most work to do. Our companies are working really, really hard inside of those corporate walls, but it's as their employees leave and they might be in the park, or they might be walking to the store, or they're taking their children to school, that they feel not welcomed. So how do we change this? I had the opportunity to go through LinkedIn. There is a diversity and inclusion belonging series And once you get through it, if it's important to you, you get a little badge on your LinkedIn profile, but that's not important to me. But what was important is it made me think about things a little bit differently. We all have unconscious bias. And so, as Dr. Barrett said, how we check our blind spots. In this series, there's no charge. Any of you can just go to LinkedIn, or I can follow up and send you the link to it. The educational content is very, very good. We had our full board of directors go through it, our whole staff. The board members have shared it with their executive teams, and it is incredibly well done and timely. The other thing that I did was there's a 21-day equity challenge. And so about 6 o'clock in the morning, I would get a text. It would take me to, maybe it was an article, maybe it was a little snippet in a movie, maybe it was a picture, maybe it was part of a book. And as you digested that information, you could blog about it. You could state your feelings, and more importantly, what can you do as an individual that will help our systemic racism in our country? So where do we go from here? We shared the work of the roundtables with our board of directors, and we actually changed our mission statement to be a catalyst for regional prosperity for all through collaborative action. And that for all was very, very intentional, that we need to make sure we are providing opportunities. You know, another example on the business track would be New North is looking to host more diversity supplier sessions so that we can get minority-owned, women-owned, and veteran-owned businesses certified so that they can compete for federal and state contracts. We also then, the board had approved us moving forward and taking these tiles and turning them really into an implementation plan. So what are the ones that we can do in the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? The ones that need a little longer time, or what are the resources that we are going to have to collect and address. And I'm incredibly pleased to share with you that Irene is certainly willing to stick with us and oversee the facilitation of the overall strategic plan. We're excited to be able to kick that off. The members that you saw on that first slide, and Dr. Barrett, thank you. They've been incredibly generous with their time and talents and have agreed to stick with this. So we envision a consulting team we'll be pulling together, and quarterly we will be having in-person meetings when we can, if not Zoom meetings, so that they can test us as to where we are in this journey. Obviously, we're going to be sharing a lot of communication with those individuals in between those meetings. So we have a lot of work to do, but we feel we have a game plan, and you really can't get things addressed. You have to start somewhere. So incredibly grateful for the people that have been surrounding our organization, and with the ultimate goal of New North being a much more welcoming region for all. I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions that anyone has of either Dr. Barrett or myself.
Yes, thank you, Barb and Dr. Barrett, Kimberly. So we have Barb's slides and Dr. Barrett's list of resources, and Joanne Mariahazi, our VP of Programs, will send all of that out to everyone when our video is posted, so we can all refer back to all of that information. Questions from anyone?
I think I'm just stunned. There was so much in there. I couldn't take notes fast enough between both of those speakers. So like, I think there's several topics that we can just have whole events on. Thank you very much. Much needed.
Well, I think we can't stress enough how important it is to our community. You know, I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, New North, an economic development organization, has embraced the need to have not just better understanding of race and racism, but also moving towards anti-racism, because it's necessary not just at a social level, but more importantly for the economy of our region. So I'm not going to be, I'm not going to be letting that lie. That's why I'm willing to continue to make sure this work is successful. And then Kimberly, your comments about how important it is to just be able to be comfortable having these discussions, that is so appropriate. I think at the end of our discussions on the last discussion on anti-racism, we talked about how difficult it is for people to have the discussions, and the greatest obstacle is fear.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just say, even if it's awkward, even if you sometimes feel like you're beating a dead horse because you are the one bringing it up all the time, keep at it, and you can do it from a place of compassion and love. It shouldn't come from a place of judgment, because we're all on this learning journey together about this issue, and so keep at it. We need to be able to talk about it. We have to get beyond the taboo nature of it. So that we can actually put it in the past, because right now we're living in the middle of it. It's not, it's not history yet.
Barb, you did mention 21-day equity challenge. Is that the Team Pro Habits by chance?
It is, yes.
Okay, all right. We'll make sure to share that link then to people too.
Sounds great.
Yes.
Also,
So I heard about it from Barb, and so I went through it, and so of course I had to share it with my friends.
Great. I'm glad you did.
there's also a 30-day challenge from the anti-racist table, which is free as well, and it's in one of the articles. The first website, I think it has access to that article. It's also one of the articles, 10 Keys to Everyday Racism, on the resource list. So there's another 30-day. After you finish that one, you can do this one.
That's great. That's great.
Dr. Barrett, can I ask, well, I guess anyone that would know, I'm on a committee at Edward Jones here where we are trying to include more people, or encourage more people to apply that is there to apply to work here, and looking to include more people rather than just the typical, white male, and wondering if there's a good way to get that word out, or to find resources to make sure we're doing a good job in that area.
Now, there are companies that, will sell you something about that. But I think knowing your, whatever your catchment area, your region is, and looking to partner with ethnic, affinity groups for one reason, whether it's the Hispanic Chamber or the African Heritage, or, I would even say, local churches, that kind of thing, any kind of area that would help you expand from just your regular, I don't know whether you do LinkedIn or what you do in your profession. And then the other thing is, most professions also have ethnic affinity groups that are they're, Black engineers, or Hispanic, or Latinx, accountants. And so most professions also have professional organizations, either that are separate or that are committees within their, national group, that could also help get the word out and expand that. And then also using personal contacts. Again, that's sometimes difficult because we live such segregated lives. But even going back to where you went to school, looking at the multicultural organizations there, student groups, career offices where folks went to school, reaching out and partnering with them to get more diverse applicants. That's just some general recommendations. Barb, you might have some more specific ones.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Barrett. I would agree with everything that she said. We had some experience with this in that We know the pandemic has disproportionately affected people of color in negative ways, obviously. A lot of the roles that they were in are not, frankly, coming back. And so it just widens our income disparity issue. And so what we did is we did partner with the American Family Foundation, Thrivent, Microsoft, and Generator to pull together classes that these are LinkedIn classes with concierge services in customer service and sales to get them jobs at the end of it. And we too kind of initially struggled. It's like, how do we reach our target audience? And so we did reach out to the affinity groups, Levin, Casablanca, the American or the African Heritage, places of worship that really said, we're going to put up flyers. We're going to talk to our congregation and let them know that these opportunities are available. So I would encourage you too to seek out those types of groups to encourage them to apply for your positions.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that question, Tina. That was great. It kind of brings it down to a real practical level. So we keep talking about the series of 3 conversations from the Belonging Committee. We've agreed, Midday Women's Alliance have agreed that we will host another series of those 3 conversations starting on Friday, January 15th. So in keeping with our midday organization, those will be held midday. So our standard 11:30 to 1 o'clock every other Friday starting on January 15th. So you should see an announcement on those shortly. I'll just say shortly since we have to get it in the system. And thank you, Sandy, for your help. And the Belonging Committee is working right now on another series of 4. So Kimberly and I are working on those together. So more to come after that. All right, so I need to move us along and pass this on to Robin Krieger to talk to us quickly about our Toastmasters club.
Hi.
Okay.
Robin
Yes.
here, there's Robin.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Sorry. We're just doing a meeting tomorrow at Osario's. And the purpose of Toastmasters is to basically work on your speaking skills and build confidence in different areas of your life. For our typical meeting, what we do is you're either given a role or you can come as a visitor, and we can go ahead and look at your grammarian. So we have a grammarian who looks at your ums and your ahs and your catcher words to help you keep going forward and being aware of those and then changing those patterns. We will be meeting at Osario's tomorrow from noon to 1 o'clock, or you can actually go on Zoom link as well. And generally the meetings are held just for an hour. And that's all I have. We look forward to seeing you there if you can make it.
Robin, is there a link you can share then for that Zoom in the chat?
Yes, I'll put it right in the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So normally I try to be a little bit more involved in the meetings, but I have construction people here today and they're banging right above my head. So thank you very much, Irene, for doing the questions and answers and the introduction. This is, it's very loud in my house. So with that being said, Sarah, can you hear? Sarah and Marianne, are we ready to adjourn?
I believe so.
There you go. Good. All right, 12:59. We did it, ladies. Awesome.
Yay.
Awesome.
Have a
Thank
great
you, Robin.
Have a good rest of your day, a good week, and happy holidays.
Yeah.
And check out our messenger, check out our newsletter.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great meeting.
Thanks. Yes, thanks. Mhm.